Hello everyone, tonight we are drifting way back to a time when the world felt both brand new and terrifyingly old, a place where the shadows danced with more than just your imagination. Picture yourself not in your comfy bed, but huddled by a flickering fire, the vast, untamed darkness pressing in from all sides. The wind whispers strange things through the reeds, or perhaps through the narrow alleyways of a nascent city. It's in these primal moments of uncertainty that the fear of unseen forces of magic, wielded with ill intent, first takes root. It's a fear that will twist and grow, consuming countless lives. And let's be honest, if you were suddenly dropped into most of these historical settings without your smartphone and a decent data plan, you probably won't survive. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And hey, why not drop your location and local time in the comments below? It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from as we journey into the night. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. You're walking not on paved streets, but on packed earth, the dust settling on your rough-spun tunic. This is ancient Mesopotamia, perhaps Sumer or Akkad, where the very first cities are rising between the fertile banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. Here the world is alive with spirits, spirits of the river, of the sky, of the reed beds, and most troublingly, spirits that can be manipulated by humans. You hear whispers of the Ashipu, the scholar magician, the one you go to when things go bump in the night or when your cow mysteriously stops giving milk. They're the good guys, the ancient world's IT support for supernatural problems, armed with clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform incantations, offering rituals to appease angry gods or drive out troublesome demons. But then there are the others, the Kashapu or Kashaptu. These are the ones whose names are spoken in hushed, fearful tones. They are the sorcerers, the witches, who use their knowledge not to heal or protect, but to curse, to bring ruin, to twist fate for their own dark purposes. Imagine your neighbor, old man Enlil Barney, suddenly looking at you a bit sideways after you accidentally outbid him for that prize-winning goat at the market. A week later, your date palm withers. Coincidence? Or did he mumble something under his breath while sprinkling suspicious-looking dust near your doorstep? The fear is palpable. You might find yourself seeking out an Ashipu to counteract the suspected malevolence, engaging in a kind of magical arms race. The famous Code of Hammurabi, dating back to around 1754 BCE, takes this fear seriously enough to legislate it. Law 2 of Hammurabi's code states that if a man casts a spell upon another man, and it is not justified, the one against whom the spell is cast shall go to the holy river. He shall leap into the holy river, and if the holy river overcomes him, he who wove the spell shall seize his house. If the holy river cleanses that man and he remains unscathed, he who cast the spell upon him shall be put to death. It's a trial by ordeal, an ancient he said, she said, with potentially lethal consequences, where the river itself becomes the ultimate arbiter of guilt. You can almost feel the cold dread as the accused is led to the water's edge. Historians still debate whether the term Kashaptu, often translated as witch, was exclusively applied to women in all periods of Mesopotamian history, or if its gender association solidified over time, becoming more distinctly female in later interpretations. It's a subtle linguistic shift, but one that echoes through the centuries. And it wasn't just direct curses. Mesopotamians had a healthy respect for the power of angry ghosts, believing they could bring all sorts of misfortune, from sickness to financial ruin. So if you were feeling a bit under the weather, it wasn't just a case of man flu. It could very well be Great Aunt Ninsanag still peeved you didn't offer her a big enough barley cake at the last family feast. Oddly enough, while they were worried about curses and ghosts, they were also quite advanced in other areas. For instance, ancient Sumerians were among the first to brew beer, a practice that probably eased a few anxieties, magical or otherwise. A little hair of the dog for when you suspect your neighbor of bewitching your livestock. now let you drift down the Nile into the sun-drenched lands of ancient Egypt. Here, magic, or Heka, is not just some fringe activity, it's a fundamental force of the universe, a power wielded by gods and humans alike. You see it everywhere in the intricate hieroglyphs adorning temple walls, in the amulets worn by everyone, from the pharaoh to the poorest farmer. The ankh, the eye of Horus, the scarab beetle. These aren't just pretty decorations. They are potent symbols of protection, life, and regeneration. You might wear an amulet to ward off scorpion stings, ensure fertility, or protect yourself from, yes, harmful magic. Egyptian magical practice was deeply intertwined with religion and medicine. Priests and priestesses were often skilled magicians, using spells and rituals for healing, for ensuring a good harvest, or for guiding the deceased safely into the afterlife. But just as in Mesopotamia, there was a flip side. The same power of Heka could be used for nefarious purposes. You might create a defixio, a curse tablet inscribed with the name of your enemy and a plea to a deity to bring them misfortune. These tablets, often made of lead, would be folded, pierced with a nail, and hidden in a place associated with the underworld, like a grave or a well. It's like sending a really nasty, supernaturally charged anonymous email, hoping the gods will do your dirty work. Dear Osiris, please make sure Thutmose trips over his own sandals during the chariot race. Thanks, a friend. Deities themselves could be ambivalent. Take Sekhmet, the lioness-headed goddess of war, plague, and healing. She could unleash terrible destruction, but she could also be appeased, and her power turned to protection. It's this duality that's key to understanding early forms of witchcraft fear. It's not about a pact with an ultimate evil, but about the misuse of existing power, a perversion of sacred forces. Let your mind wander further across the Mediterranean to the rocky shores and olive groves of ancient Greece. Here too, magic is a part of the mythological and everyday landscape. You've heard the epic tales of Circe the sorceress, who famously turned Odysseus's men into pigs. Probably not the best first date experience. And Medea, a priestess of Hecate, goddess of witchcraft, who used her formidable magical abilities for both love and terrible revenge. These figures, while mythological, reflected a societal understanding of powerful women who could manipulate the natural and supernatural worlds, often through potions and herbs. The term pharmacis feminine, or pharmakias masculine, for a sorcerer, S, is related to pharmakon, meaning drug or poison. Again, you see curse tablets called kata desmoi by the Greeks. Hundreds have been found targeting rivals in love business or even chariot races. It seems like no matter where you were in the ancient world, if you had a grudge, there was a magical way to express it, albeit with the risk of social condemnation or even legal repercussions if your harmful intent was discovered. The focus was on maleficium, harmful magic, rather than a specific theological concept of witchcraft tied to demonic allegiance, a concept that will take many more centuries to fully develop. For now, the fear is more personal, more immediate. The neighbor's blighted crops, the sudden illness, the lost love, all potentially the work of someone skilled in the darker arts, someone who has turned the very fabric of the magical world against you. You feel the ground shift beneath your feet, not literally but culturally. The air, once thick with the clamor of countless god spirits and minor deities, each demanding their little piece of your attention and offerings, is beginning to clear, or at least that's the idea. You find yourself now in the arid hills of Canaan, among a people coalescing around a radical, almost unthinkable concept. For the time, the idea of one god, a singular, all-powerful, and rather jealous deity. This is where the rules of the supernatural game start to change dramatically. It's less about balancing a cosmic checkbook of favors to various divine entities, and more about allegiance to this one supreme being. And if he's the only game in town, then any dabbling in other spiritual power sources starts to look less like eclectic spirituality and more like, well, cheating. Or worse. The whispers you hear now are not just about your neighbor cursing your goats, though that fear certainly doesn't vanish. Instead, there's a new layer, a theological condemnation. Practices that might have been commonplace or at least tolerated in Egypt or Mesopotamia, seeking out diviners, consulting spirits of the dead, using charms for fortune, are now being framed as an abomination, an affront to the unique sovereignty of Yahweh. You can almost hear the divine foot tapping impatiently. Hello, did you not get the memo? Exclusive contract here. In the emerging scriptures of the Israelites, the condemnation is stark. You hear the words perhaps chanted by a priest or read from a precious scroll, words that will echo with terrible consequence for millennia. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. This is Exodus 22:18, and the original Hebrew word, translated as witch, is mekashepha for a female, or mekasheph for a male. Scholars point out that this term likely referred to those who practiced full magic, those who used spells and substances to cause injury or misfortune, much like the Kashaptu of Mesopotamia. It wasn't necessarily about a pact with a devil, that idea is still a way off, but about harmful actions performed through supernatural means, now explicitly forbidden, because all power and all justice should flow from the one God. Imagine the scene: you're at a village gathering and someone mentions that old Sarah down the lane has been muttering strange words over a poultice again. A few generations ago you might have thought, wonder if it works. Now a seed of unease sprouts. Is she just a healer, using ancient remedies, or is she a mekashepha, undermining the divine order? The lines are becoming dangerously blurred. It's a subtle shift, but it's like going from a world where everyone has a little bit of magic, like different apps on a phone, to a world where there's only one approved operating system and anything else is malware. The Book of Deuteronomy is particularly emphatic, listing a whole catalogue of forbidden magical practices. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire, one who practices divination, or a soothsayer, or an augur, or a sorcerer, or one who casts a spell, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead. It's a comprehensive list, essentially shutting down many of the popular avenues for supernatural consultation, common in the ancient Near East. The message is clear: seek guidance from God and his prophets, not from the rustling leaves, the patterns of bird flight, or the shades of your ancestors. Trying to get a sneak peek at the future from any other source, that's a spiritual no-no. Yet human nature being what it is, the desire to know the unknowable, to influence events, or even just to connect with departed loved ones, doesn't simply vanish with a new set of theological rules. Take the famous story of King Saul and the so-called Witch of Endor from the first book of Samuel. Saul, facing a terrifying Philistine army and feeling abandoned by God, desperately seeks out a woman known for her ability to summon spirits. Disguised, he asks her to call up the spirit of the prophet Samuel. And according to the text, she does. Samuel appears, and he's not exactly thrilled about being disturbed, basically telling Saul he's toast. "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" he grumbles, which is probably standard ghost etiquette. This story is fascinating because despite the strong prohibitions against such practices, here's the king himself resorting to one. Historians still debate the precise nature of the woman of Endor's abilities and what exactly transpired. Was it genuine necromancy, a clever act of ventriloquism, or a psychological manifestation of Saul's fear? The text presents it as a real event, but it also highlights the illicit nature of the act. The woman herself is terrified when she realizes who Saul is, knowing she's breaking a capital law. It shows that even with strict condemnations, these practices persisted, often driven underground. It's an odd little detail, but while many forms of divination were condemned, the ancient Israelites did practice a form of divining God's will through the Urim and Thummim, mysterious objects kept in the breastplate of the high priest, used for casting lots to determine divine answers. How exactly these worked is lost to time, but it shows a fascinating distinction. Some forms of seeking supernatural knowledge were acceptable if divinely sanctioned, while others were strictly off limits. It's like saying, don't use those sketchy third-party psychic hotlines, use our official God-approved magic 8-ball instead. As you move forward, this monotheistic framework with its clear lines between divine power and forbidden magic begins to spread. With the rise of Christianity, which grew out of Judaism, these condemnations of sorcery and pagan practices are not only maintained, but are often intensified and reinterpreted. Early Christians living in a Roman world teeming with diverse cults, mystery religions and magical traditions remember those curse tablets from Greece faced the challenge of defining their unique faith against this backdrop. Anything that smacked of pagan ritual or magic was viewed with suspicion as competition, or worse, as demonic. The other gods of the polytheistic world weren't just dismissed as non-existent. They began to be recategorized as malevolent spirits, demons in disguise, and those who sought power from them, they were treading on very dangerous ground indeed. The stage is slowly being set for a much more sinister interpretation of what it means to be a witch. You find yourself now walking on paved roads, perhaps the Via Appia. The stones cool beneath your sandals even under the Mediterranean sun. The air hums with the sounds of a vast sprawling empire. The clatter of chariot wheels, the shouts of merchants, the tramp of legionaries' boots. This is Rome, a civilization that, much like the ones before, it had a deeply ingrained, if somewhat ambivalent, relationship with magic. You see, for the Romans, magic wasn't inherently evil. It was all about context and intent. It was a bit like their attitude towards a good gladiatorial contest. Entertaining, sometimes necessary, but you wouldn't want to be on the receiving end without a very good reason. On one hand, you have state-sanctioned religion with its elaborate rituals, auguries, divination through bird flight, which you might recall was a no-no for the Israelites, and haruspicy divination through examining the entrails of sacrificed animals. Definitely not for the squeamish and probably ruined a few good togas. These practices were performed by official priests, the pontifices and augurs, to ensure the pax deorum, the peace of the gods, and thus the prosperity and stability of Rome. This was good magic, institutionalized and aimed at collective well-being. If the chickens weren't eating properly before a big battle, that was a seriously bad omen, and someone had to figure out why. Someone checked the sacred chicken feed. Did we switch brands again? Then you have the more personal, often clandestine forms of magic. Love potions were big business, so were amulets for good luck in gambling or protection from the evil eye, that lingering envious stare that could supposedly bring misfortune. Roman literature is full of references to sorcerers and witches. Horace writes of Canidia, a terrifying figure who performs gruesome rites in a cemetery to bewitch a former lover. Apuleius, in his Metamorphoses, also known as the Golden Ass, gives a vivid, though perhaps satirized account of Pamphil, a witch who can transform herself into an owl and whose house is filled with magical paraphernalia. It makes for great storytelling, but it also reflects a genuine societal belief in and fear of such powers. The fear wasn't just of hags muttering curses over a cauldron, though. It extended to sophisticated, educated individuals who might use their knowledge for nefarious ends. One of the most significant legal frameworks addressing harmful magic was the Lex Cornelia de Sicariis et Veneficis, passed by the dictator Sulla around 81 BCE. This law dealt with assassins and poisoners. Venefician poisoner was a term often conflated with magician or sorcerer, because potions and poisons were seen as tools of their trade. Under this law, and subsequent imperial decrees, those found guilty of practicing harmful magic, especially if it led to death or serious injury, could face severe penalties including crucifixion, being burned alive, or thrown to wild beasts in the arena. Talk about a tough crowd. You might see a defixio tablet nailed to a wall in a less reputable part of the city, similar to those in Greece, calling down curses on a charioteer from a rival faction or a business competitor. May his horses stumble, may his wheels break, may his toga unravel at a really embarrassing moment. These were common enough that laws had to address them. The Romans were pragmatic. If your magic was seen to disrupt public order or harm individuals, the state would come down on you hard. It wasn't necessarily about theology, it was about maintaining social control and protecting citizens from tangible harm, whether that harm was delivered by a sword or a spell. Historians still debate the extent to which Roman emperors themselves believed in or utilized magic. Some, like Nero, were rumored to have consulted magicians and astrologers, while others, like Augustus, publicly condemned such practices while possibly engaging in some forms of divination privately. It's a murky area reflecting the empire's complex tango with the supernatural. One emperor might banish all astrologers from Rome, while the next might have a personal soothsayer on speed dial. It's like a modern politician denouncing fake news while simultaneously retweeting something from totally real news and not a Russian.com. An odd but illustrative fact about Roman belief in portents. Pliny the Elder, the famous naturalist, wrote about how the sudden appearance of an owl during the day was considered a particularly dire omen. He records instances where the city of Rome itself underwent purification rituals if an owl was seen in the forum. Imagine the flapping and hooting causing a city-wide spiritual lockdown. Nobody make any sudden moves, the day owl sees all. This highlights how deeply omens and supernatural signs were woven into the Roman psyche even at the highest levels. As the empire grew, so did the diversity of its religious and magical practices. Cults from Egypt, like that of Isis, who was associated with magic and healing, Persia Mithraism, popular with soldiers and other conquered lands, found a place in Rome. This religious syncretism meant that people had a wide array of supernatural options. But with the rise of Christianity within the empire, a new dynamic emerged. Christians, initially a persecuted minority, viewed Roman pagan rituals and magic as demonic. And as Christianity gained prominence, eventually becoming the state religion under Constantine and later Theodosius, this perspective began to influence imperial law. What was once prosecuted primarily as maleficium, harmful magic causing tangible damage, gradually started to be seen through a theological lens. Magic wasn't just a crime against an individual, it was a crime against God, a sign of demonic influence. The focus began to shift from did you harm someone with a spell to did you consort with demons to get your power. This is a crucial turning point. You see the legal language slowly evolving. Laws against divination, astrology, and various folk magic practices become more severe, not just because they might be fraudulent or harmful, but because they represent a turning away from the Christian God and an engagement with forbidden demonic forces. The groundwork laid by the biblical condemnations we saw earlier is now being built upon by the legal and theological machinery of a Christianizing Roman Empire, the definition of which is subtly expanding the shadows around the figure, growing darker and more ominous. The grand paved roads of Rome are fading behind you, crumbling at the edges, nature slowly reclaiming the masterful engineering. You find yourself in a landscape that feels more fragmented, the imperial authority that once held sway, now a distant memory in many regions. Welcome to the Dark Ages, a term historians now use with a hefty dose of caution and a raised eyebrow, but one that conveys a sense of transition and in some places a decline in centralized power and classical learning. It's a period roughly from the 5th to the 10th century where the world of Western Europe is being reshaped by migrating peoples, fledgling kingdoms, and the steady, sometimes forceful spread of Christianity into previously pagan lands. You're trudging through a muddy track in a Frankish or Anglo-Saxon village. The air smells of damp earth, wood smoke, and livestock. Life is tough, bound to the seasons and the whims of local lords. In this world, the old folk beliefs, the pre-Christian traditions of magic, healing, and divination haven't just vanished with the arrival of missionaries and monks. Instead, you witness a fascinating, sometimes uneasy blending, a syncretism of these ancient practices with the doctrines of the new Christian faith. It's like trying to mix oil and water, but sometimes you get a surprisingly stable emulsion, or at least something that doesn't immediately explode. Imagine an old woman in the village renowned for her knowledge of herbs. She can soothe a colicky baby, mend a broken bone, or provide a charm for finding lost sheep. In the old days, she might have invoked a local nature spirit or an ancient god. Now she might still use the same herbs and many of the same rituals, but perhaps she murmurs a Christian prayer alongside the older incantations, or makes the sign of the cross over the poultice. Is she a faithful Christian healer, or is she a pagan sorceress merely cloaking her old ways in a thin veneer of piety. For the local priest often struggling to impose doctrinal purity on a semi-converted populace, this is a constant headache. Agnes, are you calling on St. Cuthbert or Cernunnos for this cow's indigestion? Make up your mind. The Church in this early medieval period is certainly condemning pagan practices and what it considers harmful magic. Penitentials, handbooks for confessors, list various penances for engaging in divination spellcasting or worshipping natural objects like trees and stones. A key text reflecting this early medieval attitude is the Canon Episcopi, a piece of ecclesiastical law likely dating from the early 10th century but attributed to the 4th century Council of Ancyra. This document is significant because while condemning sorcery, it also dismisses the belief that women could physically fly through the night with the goddess Diana or Herodias figures, often associated with nocturnal spirit cavalcades, as mere demonic illusion or fantasy. It states that these women are deluded, tricked by the devil in their dreams. This is important. The Church at this stage is often more inclined to see such claims as foolish superstition rather than evidence of a genuine pact with demonic forces leading to actual physical transformation or flight. The witches are misguided, not necessarily powerful demonic agents. However, the fear of maleficium, harmful magic, remains very real in the everyday lives of people. If your crops fail, your child falls ill, or your butter churns unsuccessfully, a surprisingly common accusation against supposed witches. As butter was vital, it's easy to suspect that someone in the community has it in for you and has used supernatural means to cause harm. You might accuse your neighbor of making a look at your prize pig, causing it to sicken. Accusations are often personal, rooted in village squabbles, envy, or misfortune. The local lord or community might deal with such accusations through traditional means like ordeal, remember Hammurabi's river plunge, or by compelling the accused to swear an oath of innocence, supported by oath helpers. Historians still debate the extent to which pre-Christian goddess cults and shamanistic practices directly influenced the later stereotype of the witch. Some, like Margaret Murray in the early 20th century, proposed a controversial theory of a surviving organized pagan witch cult, which most modern scholars have largely discredited. However, it's undeniable that elements of folk belief, sacred groves, reverence for natural forces, women as healers and keepers of traditional law, persisted and were often viewed with suspicion by church authorities, gradually becoming entwined with developing ideas about witchcraft. You might encounter charms and amulets everywhere, a fascinating blend of Christian symbols and older folk magic. Someone might wear a crucifix next to a boar's tooth for protection. A farmer might bury a ritually prepared object in his field to ensure fertility, perhaps whispering a prayer to a saint and a half-remembered plea to an old earth spirit. It's a pragmatic approach to a dangerous world. If a little bit of everything helps, why not try it? It's like having both an antivirus program and a dream catcher next to your computer, just in case. An odd fact from this period, some early medieval laws like those of the Salian Franks prescribed fines for aerial witchcraft, specifically for those accused of consuming a person from within, then flying off to place a cauldron on their house. This sounds remarkably like later witch beliefs, suggesting that some of these more fantastical ideas were already circulating in folk tradition, even if the official church position as seen in the Canon Episcopi was more skeptical about their literal reality. It's a strange image, tiny witches flying around stealing your essence and then leaving their cookware on your roof. Honey, did you leave the cauldron out again? The neighbors are talking. The efforts to Christianize Europe are ongoing and uneven. In Scandinavia, for example, Viking beliefs in Seda, a form of Norse magic often practiced by women called Völur, coexisted and clashed with Christianity for centuries. These traditions involve prophecy, shape-shifting, and communion with spirits, all things that would later feed into the darker imagery of witchcraft. As the Church's influence grows and its structures become more organized, it will seek greater uniformity in belief and practice. The grey areas of folk magic, the syncretic blendings, will become less tolerated. The groundwork is being laid for a more systematic theological definition of witchcraft, one that will move beyond harmful magic and foolish delusion towards something far more sinister heresy and a deliberate pact with the ultimate evil. The shadows are indeed lengthening. You feel the intellectual currents shifting, a sharpening of definitions, a more rigorous, almost scholastic approach to matters of faith and the supernatural. The earlier medieval period, with its sometimes hazy blend of folk beliefs and nascent Christian doctrine, is giving way to a more organized and assertive church, particularly from the 11th century onwards. This is the High Middle Ages, a time of crusades, of the construction of soaring Gothic cathedrals, and the rise of universities where scholars debate the finer points of theology with an intensity that could curdle milk. And within this intellectual ferment, the figure of the witch is being meticulously and ominously redefined. You're no longer just worried about old Agnes down the lane and her potentially dodgy herbal remedies, or her ability to make your butter go bad. The concern is escalating beyond simple maleficium. Theologians influenced by revived Aristotelian logic and a growing body of demonological literature are starting to paint a picture of witchcraft not merely as misguided folk practice or harmful sorcery, but as a deliberate, organized heresy, a conscious rejection of God, and an allegiance with his ultimate adversary, the devil. This is a game changer. It's like going from worrying about individual hackers to facing a coordinated state-sponsored cyber attack. You witness the church, through its councils and papal decrees, flexing its institutional muscles. The focus intensifies on rooting out not just pagan survivals, but any deviation from officially sanctioned doctrine. Heretical movements like the Cathars in southern France, who held dualistic beliefs about good and evil gods, are met with brutal suppression, including the Albigensian Crusade in the early 13th century. While not directly about witchcraft initially, the mechanisms developed to identify, interrogate, and punish heretics, particularly the establishment of the Papal Inquisition in the 1230s, will provide a ready-made template for the witch hunts to come. The inquisitors, often Dominicans or Franciscans, were trained in theology and law, tasked with uncovering hidden networks of dissent. Their methods, including detailed record-keeping, the use of informants, and crucially the legal sanctioning of torture to extract confessions, would prove devastatingly effective when turned towards suspected witches. A pivotal development is the increasing theological emphasis on the demonic pact. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, one of the most influential theologians of the Middle Ages, discussed demons and their potential influence on the world in his Summa Theologica. While Aquinas himself didn't write extensively on witches in the way later demonologists would, his work on angelic and demonic hierarchies and the nature of evil provided a sophisticated intellectual framework that could be used to understand witchcraft as a genuine and dangerous interaction with demonic powers. He affirmed that demons could indeed interfere in human affairs and perform acts that seemed magical, though always with God's permission. This lent a terrifying credibility to the idea that humans could actively solicit demonic aid. If a scholar, as respected as Aquinas, said demons were real and could mess with stuff, then who were you to argue? You start to hear new disturbing details associated with witches, not just casting spells, but worshipping the devil, engaging in orgiastic rites, the infamous Sabbat, desecrating sacred objects like the crucifix or the Eucharist, and even having sexual intercourse with demons, the succubus and incubus. These elements, often absent in earlier conceptions of village sorcery, point to a constructed, learned stereotype of the witch as an anti-Christian part of a diabolical conspiracy. The witch is no longer just a malevolent individual. She, and increasingly, she is a soldier in Satan's army. Historians still debate how much of this evolving stereotype of the diabolical witch was driven by popular belief filtering upwards, and how much was imposed downwards by ecclesiastical and legal elites. It was likely a complex interplay. Pre-existing folk fears of harmful magic and night-flying spirits, remember the canon episcopi dismissing those flights as illusion, were now being reinterpreted through the lens of demonic conspiracy. That old woman who claimed to fly with Diana. Perhaps she wasn't just deluded. Perhaps Diana was a demon in disguise, and the flight was real, a journey to a blasphemous Sabbath. The development of scholastic thought, with its emphasis on categorization and logical argumentation, ironically helped to solidify these fantastical beliefs. If demons exist, which was theologically undeniable, and if humans have free will, also theologically undeniable, then it logically followed that humans could choose to make a pact with demons. The logic, once you accepted the premises, was uncomfortably sound. It's like a really well-argued internet conspiracy theory. Step by step, it all seems to make a twisted kind of sense until you realize the foundational assumptions are bonkers. An odd off-topic fact from this era of intense religious focus: medieval monks, particularly Cistercians, became incredibly skilled hydraulic engineers. They developed sophisticated water-powered systems for their monasteries, not just for grinding grain, but even for things like powering bellows in forges or tanning leather. While some were busy defining demonic hierarchies, others were figuring out how to get better water pressure for the abbey's laundry. Practical magic, you might say. The idea of the Sabbat, the nocturnal gathering of witches, is particularly potent. It's a direct inversion of Christian ritual, the kiss of shame given to the devil's rear end instead of a kiss of peace, feasting on unbaptized babies instead of the Eucharist, black masses instead of holy mass. These lurid details, often extracted under torture or suggested by interrogators familiar with demonological literature, created a terrifying and self-perpetuating image. Once someone confessed to attending a Sabbat, and under enough pain, people will confess to anything, it proved. The Sabbat was real, encouraging inquisitors to look for more attendees. The church is laying down the theological and legal infrastructure. The enemy is being clearly defined, not just a local troublemaker with a knack for curses, but a heretic, a devotee of Satan, a threat to the very fabric of Christendom. The fear is becoming more abstract, more theological, but also paradoxically more systematized and therefore more dangerous for those who fall under suspicion. The stage is being set not just for individual accusations, but for widespread persecution. The kindling is being gathered. The scent of old parchment and dread fills the air. You find yourself in a dimly lit study, perhaps in a monastery or a university library late in the 15th century. Before you, or at least on the mental landscape we're painting, lies a book. It's not an ancient scroll or a roughly bound penitential. This is a printed book, a product of the relatively new technology of the printing press, which means its contents can be disseminated far more widely and uniformly than ever before. And this particular book, my friends, is a doozy. It's the Malleus Maleficarum, Latin for the Hammer of Witches. If the previous centuries were about gathering the kindling for the witch pyres, this book is the match soaked in theological kerosene. Published in 1487 by two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. The Malleus Maleficarum is less a theological treatise and more of a witch hunter's instruction manual, a detailed guide on how to identify, interrogate, and convict witches. It's a chillingly systematic work divided into 3 parts. The first part argues for the reality of witchcraft, refuting skeptics like those pesky canon episcopi adherents who thought it was all just illusion, and establishing witchcraft as a demonic, heretical practice. It leans heavily on the idea of the pact with the devil, portraying witches as not just individuals who dabble in harmful magic, but as members of an organized sect conspiring against Christendom. Oh, you think witches aren't real? Kramer and Sprenger basically say, hold my holy water. The second part delves into the specific forms that witchcraft takes, how witches cast spells, cause storms, make men impotent, a recurring obsession in the book, harm livestock, and offer unbaptized children to demons. It's a catalogue of horrors drawing on existing folk beliefs, theological interpretations, and, importantly, confessions extracted from accused witches, often under torture. This section is particularly lurid, detailing supposed sexual relations between witches and demons, incubi and succubi, remember them, and the infamous witches' Sabbat. It's like the darkest, most twisted, frequently asked questions about demonic collaboration you could imagine. The third part is the procedural section, providing detailed instructions for judges and inquisitors on how to conduct witch trials. It covers everything from initiating proceedings, rumor, and public outcry were often enough, to questioning witnesses, to the interrogation of the accused. And here's where it gets truly terrifying. The Malleus explicitly recommends the use of torture to extract confessions. It gives advice on how to overcome a witch's supposed demonic protection against pain, suggesting that they might be hiding charms or that their silence is a sign of demonic aid. It even discusses how to deceive the accused into confessing, for example, by promising mercy that the inquisitor has no intention of granting. It's a manual for a rigged game where accusation often led inexorably to conviction and execution. One of the most infamous and influential aspects of the Malleus Maleficarum is its pronounced misogyny. While it acknowledges that men can be witches, the book argues that women are far more susceptible to demonic temptation and witchcraft due to their perceived inherent weaknesses. They are supposedly more credulous, more impressionable, more carnal, and more prone to vanity and malice. Kramer, who is believed to have written most of the text, draws on classical and biblical interpretations of female frailty. The very title, Hammer of Witches, implies a violent suppression, and the text leaves no doubt that women are the primary targets. He even engages in some truly tortured etymology, suggesting that femina woman comes from fee faith and minus, less meaning, less faith. It's the kind of linguistic gymnastics that would make a contortionist blush, but it served to prove women's natural inclination towards heresy. It's science, he might as well have said, really bad, made-up science. The impact of the Malleus Maleficarum was enormous, though historians still debate its precise initial reception versus its long-term influence. It wasn't an instant bestseller everywhere, and some church authorities were initially skeptical of its more extreme claims and its author's credentials. Kramer had a bit of a reputation for being overzealous, to put it mildly. He'd been kicked out of at least one town for trying to stir up witch hunts. However, thanks to the printing press, it went through numerous editions over the next 2 centuries, becoming a standard reference work for magistrates, judges, and clergy involved in witch trials across many parts of Europe, especially in Germany, France, and Switzerland. It provided a veneer of theological and legal authority for persecutions that were often driven by local anxieties and accusations. If a judge was unsure how to proceed, the Malleus offered a terrifyingly clear roadmap. Oddly enough, despite its grim subject matter, the Malleus Maleficarum contains some rather bizarre facts. For instance, it discusses how witches can steal men's penises, sometimes keeping them in birds' nests or boxes where they apparently move about like living creatures. This isn't presented as a metaphor, it's discussed as a literal act of magical castration and theft. One can only imagine the poor fellow trying to explain that to his wife or the local authorities. "Honey, I swear the witch from down the lane. She has it in her cuckoo clock." The publication of the Malleus coincides with a period of increasing social and religious unrest. The late 15th and early 16th centuries are a prelude to the Reformation, a time of anxiety about heresy, social order, and the perceived decline of morality. In this climate, the witch as defined by the Malleus becomes a perfect scapegoat, an internal enemy allied with the ultimate external enemy, Satan, working to undermine society from within. The book didn't invent the fear of witches, but it codified it, amplified it, and provided a terrifyingly practical toolkit for acting on that fear. It legitimized the hunt, transforming scattered, localized anxieties into a more systematic, ideologically driven persecution. The theoretical framework is now firmly in place, the legal tools sharpened. The stage is set for the great witch hunts to ignite across Europe. You feel a chill in the air, a sense of pervasive unease that goes beyond the usual concerns of daily life. It's the late 15th and 16th centuries, stretching into the 17th, and Europe is a continent grappling with immense upheaval. The world you knew or thought you knew is fracturing. The monolithic authority of the Catholic Church is being challenged by the Protestant Reformation, leading to bitter religious conflicts and wars that tear communities apart. Climate change, in the form of the Little Ice Age, brings unpredictable weather, failed harvests, and famine. Outbreaks of plague and other devastating diseases continue to sweep through populations, leaving a trail of death and despair. It's a perfect storm of anxieties, and in times of great fear and uncertainty, people desperately look for explanations for someone to blame. And who better to point the finger at than the witch, that diabolical agent of chaos conveniently described in books like The Malleus Maleficarum. You're living in a village, perhaps in the German-speaking lands, or France, or Switzerland, areas that will become notorious hotspots for witch trials. Your small community, once relatively stable, is now simmering with tension. Perhaps your village is divided along religious lines, Catholic versus Protestant, and each side suspects the other of being in league with the devil. Or maybe it's just the relentless pressure of survival. The crops have failed for the third year. Running. The cows are dying. Children are falling sick with mysterious illnesses. Who is responsible? It can't just be bad luck, can it? Surely such misfortunes must be the work of malice, of supernatural evil. The figure of the witch, already a potent symbol of inverted Christian values thanks to theologians and inquisitors, becomes an all-purpose scapegoat. She and it is overwhelmingly she, though men are accused too, is blamed for everything from hailstorms that flatten the barley to unexplained illnesses from impotency in men, still a popular accusation thanks Kramer, to difficult childbirths. She becomes the focus of communal anxieties, the explanation for the inexplicable. It's easier to blame a malevolent neighbor than to confront the terrifying randomness of disease, the complex socio-economic factors leading to poverty, or the unsettling idea that God might not be exclusively on your side in a religious war. The milk curdled again. That's not a refrigeration issue, that's old Marjorie, giving it the evil eye because I wouldn't lend her my donkey. A chilling historical fact from this period is the sheer scale of the persecutions in certain regions. For example, in the territory of Quedlinburg in Germany, over 130 people were executed for witchcraft in a single day in 1589. This wasn't an isolated incident. Some smaller territories in the Holy Roman Empire, Switzerland and parts of France saw intense panics, where a significant percentage of the local population could be accused, tortured and executed. These weren't just isolated cases anymore, they were localized frenzies, chain reaction hunts, where one accused person under torture would name others who would then be arrested and tortured, naming more, and so on. It's a terrifying feedback loop of fear and accusation. You see how social dynamics play into this? Often the accused are women who are already marginalized elderly widows, poor women who might rely on begging, or charity women known for their sharp tongues or eccentric behavior, or those who practice traditional healing and midwifery. These individuals are vulnerable, easily targeted. If a midwife was present at a birth that went badly, or if a healer's remedies failed, suspicion could easily fall upon them. Remember all those useful folk remedies and charms from earlier centuries? Now that knowledge can be a death sentence. What was once seen as perhaps quirky or even helpful could now be twisted into evidence of a demonic pact. Historians still debate the precise triggers for these localized panics. Was it economic hardship, religious fanaticism, the influence of particular zealous demonologists or magistrates, or a combination of all these factors? It seems that in areas with weak central authority, fragmented jurisdictions and intense religious strife, the hunts were often more severe. Where local courts had more autonomy and were susceptible to popular pressure, the pyres burned more frequently. It's a grim lottery of geography and governance. An odd detail that highlights the anxieties of the time people became obsessed with identifying witches' marks, moles, birthmarks, scars, or any unusual skin blemish, which were believed to be spots where the devil or a demonic familiar had branded or suckled the witch. Professional witch prickers emerged who would jab these marks with needles. If the spot didn't bleed or the accused didn't feel pain, which could easily be faked by a skilled pricker using a retractable point, it was taken as proof of witchcraft. Imagine the terror of being stripped and prodded your fate, hanging on whether a mole bleeds on command. It's like a really awful high-stakes game of pin the tail on the donkey, except the donkey is you and the tail is a sharp instrument of accusation. The Reformation, ironically, did not immediately lead to a decline in witch hunts. In fact, in some areas, The competition between Catholics and Protestants to prove their piety and their zeal in combating evil may have even intensified the persecutions. Both sides accused the other of being lax on witches, or even of being witches themselves. Martin Luther, for example, believed firmly in the reality of witchcraft and the devil's active presence in the world, and he advocated for the execution of witches. John Calvin, too, supported the persecution of witches in Geneva. The idea that the devil was particularly active in these times of religious turmoil was widespread, providing further fuel for the fires. You are caught in a climate of fear where your neighbor's misfortune could become your death warrant. A careless word, a past grudge, a reputation for being different, any of these could be enough to draw suspicion. The legal processes, especially when guided by manuals like the Malleus, and fueled by the acceptance of spectral evidence testimony about dreams and visions of the accused committing witchcraft and confessions extracted under duress, offer little hope for the accused. The system is designed to confirm guilt, not to find truth. The age of anxiety has found its perfect victim, and the scapegoat is paying a terrible price for the world's ills. The embers of fear fanned by societal upheaval and theological certainty now burst into a raging inferno. You find yourself squarely in the 16th and early 17th centuries, the period often referred to by historians as the Burning Times. Though the methods of execution varied, this is the peak of the European witch hunts, a continent-wide frenzy that sees tens of thousands, mostly women, accused, tortured, and killed. The fear is no longer a localized simmer, it's a rolling boil spilling across borders, fueled by a potent cocktail of religious fervor, political opportunism, and deeply ingrained misogyny, all neatly packaged in those ever-so-helpful witch-hunting manuals. You could be anywhere in a vast swathe of Europe, from the fiercely contested religious territories of the Holy Roman Empire, modern-day Germany, Austria, Switzerland, to the fields of France, the highlands of Scotland, or even parts of Scandinavia. The intensity varies, but the underlying dread is pervasive. Imagine the scene: a village crier announces that the authorities, perhaps an itinerant witch judge or a local magistrate, armed with his copy of the Malleus Maleficarum or a similar tract, are arriving to investigate rumors of witchcraft. A hush falls over the marketplace. Eyes dart nervously. Who has been too lucky with their crops lately? Whose cow produced an unnatural amount of milk? Who argued with whom last week? The smallest, most mundane village dispute can escalate into a life-or-death accusation. This is no longer just about punishing isolated acts of maleficium. The concept of the diabolical witch conspiracy, the Sabbath, the pact with Satan, the organized assault on Christendom, is now firmly entrenched in the minds of many prosecutors, theologians, and a terrified populace. You hear tales, often extracted under excruciating torture, of witches flying on broomsticks or goats, or even demons in disguise, to nocturnal gatherings where they renounce Christ, kiss the devil's backside, still a hit on the demonic party, circuit, desecrate holy sacraments, and plot all manner of evil against their communities, causing storms, blighting crops, spreading disease among humans and livestock. It's a terrifying narrative, and once an accusation is made, the pressure to confess and to name accomplices is immense. Refusal to confess is often seen as proof of demonic assistance, a sign that the devil is giving the witch strength to resist. It's a classic catch-22, or as they might have said then, a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, emphasis on the damned. The scale of the hunts in some regions during this period is truly staggering. For instance, the Prince-Bishopric of Würzburg in Germany under Prince Bishop Philipp Adolf von Ehrenberg saw an estimated 900 executions for witchcraft between 1626 and 1631. This wasn't just targeting the poor and marginalized. Accusations reached into all levels of society, including town councillors, merchants, and even clergy. Similarly, the nearby Prince-Bishopric of Bamberg experienced a series of horrific hunts. These were not isolated incidents, but systematic campaigns of terror, often driven by zealous individuals in positions of power who genuinely believed they were fighting a holy war against Satan's minions. The detailed records kept during some of these trials, including the meticulous accounts of torture, and the often formulaic confessions paint a horrifying picture of judicial murder on a grand scale. You witness how political and economic factors can exacerbate the hunts. In times of war, famine, or plague, the search for scapegoats intensifies. A ruler might use a witch hunt to consolidate power, eliminate rivals, or distract a restless population. Confiscated property of convicted witches could also be a lucrative source of income for the authorities or for informers, creating a perverse incentive for accusations. It's a cynical game where fear and greed walk hand in hand. Times are tough, the treasury's a bit low. Anyone seen any suspicious old ladies lately? Asking for a friend? Of the state, of course. Historians still debate the exact number of victims across Europe, with estimates ranging from 40,000 to 100,000 executed between the 15th and 18th centuries, with the vast majority occurring during this peak period. What is clear is that certain regions suffered far more than others. The Holy Roman Empire, Switzerland, France, and Scotland were particularly hard hit. Spain and Italy, despite having active inquisitions, actually saw fewer executions for witchcraft, as their inquisitors were often more focused on heresy and Judaizing, and sometimes more skeptical of the more fantastical claims about diabolical sabbats compared to their northern European counterparts. It's a complex map of persecution, an odd, almost surreal detail from some witch trials, particularly in areas influenced by the Malleus, was the swimming test, or judicium aquae frigidae. The accused, often bound thumb to opposite toe, would be thrown into a body of water. If they floated, it was seen as a sign that the pure element of water was rejecting them, thus proving their guilt. If they sank and potentially drowned, they were considered innocent. This practice, though ancient and not universally applied, shows the desperation and flawed logic underpinning some of these proofs. It's like saying, if you survive this clearly unsurvivable thing, you're guilty. If you die, well, oops, our bad, at least you're innocent. It's a no-win scenario worthy of a Monty Python sketch if it weren't so tragically real. The role of children as accusers also becomes prominent in some hunts. Sometimes children, perhaps caught up in the hysteria, encouraged by adults or seeking attention, would accuse neighbors or even family members. Their testimonies, often vivid and dramatic, could be particularly damning, as children were sometimes seen as being too innocent to lie about such grave matters, or too easily manipulated to tell the right story. This adds another layer of tragedy and social breakdown to the already horrifying picture. The pan-European frenzy is not monolithic. It ebbs and flows, flares up in one region while subsiding in another. But the underlying belief system, the fear of the diabolical witch, has taken deep root. It's a contagion of fear spread by sermons, pamphlets, rumor, and the very processes of the trials themselves. As you stand amidst this era of intense persecution, the smoke from the pyres seems to blot out the sun, and the cries of the accused echo in the very foundations of European society. You feel the damp chill of the English countryside, perhaps a misty morning in Essex or Lancashire. While the continental witch hunts are raging with their elaborate theories of demonic pacts, sabbats, and diabolical conspiracies, you notice something a little different here in England. The air is still thick with fear, and accusations of witchcraft are certainly not uncommon, but the legal framework and the popular understanding of what a witch does have a distinctly English flavour. It's like they ordered the witchcraft fear combo meal but asked for a different side dish. Across the Channel, inquisitors and magistrates armed with the Malleus Maleficarum and similar texts are often obsessed with the heresy of witchcraft, the pact with the devil, the attendance at the Sabbat. In England, however, while such ideas are not entirely unknown, especially among the educated elite, the primary concern for much of the period is maleficium, the actual harm caused by witchcraft. Did Goody Miller's cow suddenly go dry after you had an argument with her? Did Master Fletcher's child fall ill after you muttered under your breath? The focus is more on practical, tangible damages rather than theological transgressions. It's less, did you dance with demons, and more, did you make my prize-winning pig inexplicably ill? The legal system reflects this. England did not have the Roman law-based inquisitorial system common on the continent. which relied heavily on confessions often extracted by torture, which was not routinely legal in ordinary English criminal trials, though it could be used under royal warrant in cases of treason. Instead, English witch trials proceeded under common law, meaning they were accusatorial. Someone had to bring a formal accusation, and guilt was determined by a jury, much like other felonies such as theft or murder. This didn't necessarily make it fairer for the accused. Local prejudices and mass hysteria could still sway a jury, but it did mean the process was different. There wasn't the same systematic pressure to confess to diabolical pacts or name accomplices to a sabbat that you'd find in, say, a German prince-bishopric. The first major English statute specifically against witchcraft was passed in 1542 under Henry VIII, but it was relatively mild and short-lived. More significant were the Elizabethan Act of 1563 and the Jacobean Act of 1604. The 1563 Act made it a felony to invoke evil spirits for any purpose, including treasure hunting or love magic, and imposed the death penalty if witchcraft resulted in a person's death. The 1604 Act passed under King James I, who, as James VI of Scotland, had a deep and rather paranoid interest in witchcraft. Even writing a book on it called Demonology was harsher. It made any pact with evil spirits a capital offence, even if no harm resulted. This brought English law somewhat closer to continental ideas by criminalising the pact itself, but in practice most English trials still revolved around evidence of maleficium. You might attend an English witch trial. Instead of learned theologians debating demonology, you're more likely to see neighbours testifying about unexplained illnesses, dead livestock or spoiled food that occurred after a run-in with the accused. Evidence might include the discovery of witches' marks, though the professional prickers were less common here than in Scotland, or the finding of familiars, small animals like cats, dogs, toads, or even insects believed to be demonic spirits in animal form that served the witch and suckled on her blood. The image of the old woman with her black cat takes on a sinister hue here. That's not just a cat, that's Beelzebub Jr. on a dairy-sucking mission. Historians still debate why England, for the most part, avoided the large-scale chain reaction hunts seen in some parts of Europe. The different legal system, the relative stability of central government compared to the fragmented Holy Roman Empire, and perhaps a greater degree of skepticism among some of the judiciary might have played a role. However, this doesn't mean England was immune. There were significant localized panics, most famously the Pendle witch trials in Lancashire in 1612, which resulted in 10 executions and the activities of the self-proclaimed witch-finder General Matthew Hopkins during the English Civil War in the 1640s. Hopkins and his associates, operating in a period of social and legal breakdown, were responsible for the deaths of an estimated 200 to 300 people in East Anglia, using sleep deprivation and other coercive methods that skirted the edges of legal torture to extract confessions. He even had a handy checklist for finding witches, efficiency in all things, even persecution. An odd and rather specific English folk belief connected to witchcraft was the idea of witch bottles. If you believed you were bewitched, you might prepare a special bottle, often a ceramic Bellarmine jug, those stoneware jugs with a bearded face on them, filled with your urine nail clippings, hair, and bent pins or thorns. The bottle would then be sealed and either buried or hidden in the house, sometimes heated in a fire. The belief was that this would cause torment to the witch who had cast the spell, forcing them to reveal themselves or lift the curse. It's a kind of magical counterattack, like a supernatural booby trap. Take that, Agnes. Hope you enjoy the sensation of hot, pin-filled pee. While diabolical pacts weren't the primary focus, they weren't absent. King James I's Demonology, 1597, certainly promoted the idea of a demonic conspiracy, and his influence after he ascended the English throne in 1603 contributed to the harsher 1604 Witchcraft Act. He was famously convinced that a group of Scottish witches in league with the devil had tried to assassinate him and his queen by raising storms at sea in 1590, the North Berwick witch trials. His personal obsession with the topic undoubtedly lent royal authority to witch-hunting efforts. So while you might not see as many pyres blazing for the crime of attending a sabbat in England, the fear of the village witch, the one who could blight your life with a curse, or a malevolent stare was very real. The legal mechanisms were different. The emphasis slightly shifted, but the outcome for many accused women and some men was just as deadly. England's path was peculiar, but it still led all too often to the gallows. You feel the salt spray on your face, not from the English Channel this time, but from the vast, unforgiving Atlantic. You're on a cramped, creaking ship, part of a wave of colonists seeking new lives, religious freedom, or perhaps just a fresh start in the new world. But as you leave the old world behind, you bring more than just your meager possessions and hopes for the future. You also bring your fears, your beliefs, and your deeply ingrained anxieties about the devil and his earthly agents. And in the stark, often challenging environment of colonial America, particularly in the Puritan settlements of New England, these fears will find fertile ground to sprout into a uniquely American nightmare. You land in Massachusetts Bay Colony late in the 17th century. The landscape is rugged, the winters harsh, and life is a constant struggle against the elements, disease, and the perceived threats from the surrounding wilderness, including the Native American populations whose lands you are steadily encroaching upon. For the Puritan settlers, this is more than just a physical battle. It's a spiritual one. They see themselves as God's chosen people, building a city on a hill, a beacon of true piety in a world corrupted by sin. But this divine mission also means they believe themselves to be under constant assault from Satan, who is desperate to undermine their holy experiment. Every misfortune, a failed crop, an illness, a conflict with neighbors, can be interpreted as a sign of God's displeasure, or more terrifyingly, as the work of witches in their midst. The most infamous outbreak of witch hysteria in colonial America, the one that has become almost synonymous with the term witch hunt, erupts in Salem Village, now Danvers, Massachusetts, in 1692. You find yourself in this small, faction-ridden farming community already simmering with local disputes over land, church leadership, and social status. The spark ignites in the household of the Reverend Samuel Parris, where his daughter-niece and other young women begin to exhibit strange behaviors. Fits, convulsions, blasphemous screaming. They claim to be tormented by unseen forces, pricked and pinched by spectres, and soon they begin to name their tormentors, local women, often those who are somehow other, the enslaved Tituba, the impoverished Sarah Good, the argumentative Sarah Osborne. What starts as a localized curiosity quickly spirals out of control. The afflicted girls become a kind of grim celebrity, their accusations carrying immense weight. A key factor in the Salem crisis was the controversial acceptance of spectral evidence by the Special Court of Oyer and Terminer, established to hear the cases. Spectral evidence referred to testimony from the afflicted that they had seen the apparition or spectre of the accused tormenting them, even if the accused was physically elsewhere at the time. This was highly problematic as it was impossible to disprove. If a girl screamed that Bridget Bishop's ghost was choking her, how could Bridget prove her ghost was in fact at home knitting? It's like trying to provide an alibi for your dream self. But Your Honor, my astral projection was binge-watching Netflix all night. The accusations spread like wildfire, fueled by a potent mix of genuine belief, social anxieties, personal vendettas, and perhaps even psychological factors. Among the accusers, historians still debate the causes of the girls' initial afflictions. Were they truly bewitched, suffering from a physical ailment like ergot poisoning from contaminated rye, faking it, or experiencing some form of conversion disorder or mass hysteria? The accused were not just marginalized outcasts. As the panic grew, accusations reached respected members of the community, including wealthy merchants and even the wife of the governor. This was terrifying because it suggested the devil's tendrils had reached deep into the heart of Puritan society. You witnessed the trials presided over by magistrates like William Stoughton, who was a firm believer in the reality of the diabolical plot. Unlike in England, where torture was less common in regular trials, the accused at Salem faced intense psychological pressure, prolonged interrogations without counsel, and conditions that amounted to coercion. While formal physical torture wasn't officially sanctioned in the same way as in some continental trials, the pressure to confess was immense. A confession, especially one that named other witches, could sometimes save an accused person from the gallows, though they would remain imprisoned and their property confiscated. Refusal to confess, however, was often seen as a sign of obdurate guilt. Giles Corey, an elderly farmer, famously refused to enter a plea and was subjected to peine forte et dure, pressed to death with heavy stones, a brutal, archaic punishment. His last words were reportedly, "more weight." An odd and tragic detail from the Salem trials is that even dogs were not immune to accusation. At least 2 dogs were accused of witchcraft and executed presumably for aiding their witch masters or acting as familiars. It's a grim reminder of how pervasive the fear had become, extending even to the animal kingdom. Bad dog, not only did you chew my slippers, but you consorted with demons to do it. By the time the hysteria subsided in late 1692 and early 1693, often credited to growing skepticism among some clergy and officials, including Governor Phipps, especially after his own wife was accused, and the influential writings of ministers like Increase Mather, who questioned the reliability of spectral evidence, the damage was done. 19 people had been hanged, Giles Corey pressed to death, and several others died in prison. Many more had their lives and reputations ruined. The Salem witch trials stand as a stark warning about the dangers of mass hysteria, the corruption of justice when fear trumps reason, and the tragic consequences of allowing unsubstantiated accusations to dictate legal outcomes. While witch trials occurred elsewhere in colonial America both before and after Salem, none reached the same level of intensity or infamy. The shadow of Salem would linger long in the American consciousness, a sobering reminder of how a community convinced of its own righteousness and terrified of an unseen enemy could turn so savagely upon itself. You feel a subtle but profound shift in the intellectual atmosphere. The flickering candlelight of superstition and fervent belief is slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, being challenged by the bright, clear rays of reason and scientific inquiry. You're moving into the late 17th and more significantly the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment. This is a period where thinkers like Isaac Newton are unlocking the mechanical secrets of the universe, where philosophers like John Locke are championing natural rights and empirical observation, and where a new confidence in human intellect is beginning to chip away at the foundations of long-held beliefs, including the very real, very terrifying conviction in witchcraft that had fueled centuries of persecution. The change isn't sudden or universal. You can still find pockets of intense witch belief, and accusations don't just vanish overnight. But among the educated elite, the judiciary, and even some segments of the clergy, a growing skepticism is taking root. The elaborate demonological theories that underpinned the great witch hunts, the tales of sabbats and diabolical pacts, start to seem less like established fact and more like, well, a bit far-fetched. It's like people are finally starting to ask, weight flying on broomsticks, really, have you seen the aerodynamics on those things? You witness the legal frameworks that facilitated the hunts beginning to be dismantled. A landmark event is the repeal of the English Witchcraft Act of 1604 in 1736. The new legislation, often called the Witchcraft Act of 1735 as it was passed in that parliamentary session, didn't just stop punishing accused witches with death. It fundamentally changed the legal understanding of witchcraft. It made it a crime to pretend to have magical powers or to accuse someone else of witchcraft. Suddenly the tables are turned. It's no longer a capital offense to be a witch. It's a misdemeanor to claim you are one or to point fingers. This was a profound shift, reflecting a growing consensus among the ruling classes that witchcraft, as traditionally understood, was not a real phenomenon threatening society, but rather a superstition that could lead to injustice and social disorder. So you say you can summon demons? That's nice. Here's a fine for fraud, and maybe see a doctor about those delusions. This legal change didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the culmination of decades of changing intellectual currents. Thinkers were increasingly emphasizing natural explanations for events. If a hailstorm ruined the crops, perhaps it was due to meteorological conditions, not a coven of witches. If someone fell ill, perhaps it was a recognizable disease, not a curse. The rise of scientific methodology, with its emphasis on evidence observation and repeatable experiments, made the often flimsy and spectral evidence used in witch trials look increasingly suspect. The universe, it seemed, operated according to rational laws, not the whims of demons or the incantations of village sorcerers. You see, influential figures begin to speak out more openly against the witch trials. In Germany, Christian Thomasius, a jurist and philosopher, argued powerfully against the belief in witchcraft and the use of torture in legal proceedings in the early 18th century. In England, Francis Hutchinson's An Historical Essay Concerning Witchcraft 1718 systematically debunked many famous witch cases and criticized the flawed evidence upon which convictions had been based. These weren't lone voices crying in the wilderness, they were part of a growing chorus. Historians still debate the exact timeline and the primary drivers of this decline in witch prosecutions. Was it the rise of scientific thinking, legal reforms, a changing religious outlook that, while still believing in God and the devil, was less inclined to see Satan's hand in every mundane misfortune? Or was it simply that the witch hunts had in some areas burned themselves out, leaving behind a legacy of exhaustion and revulsion at the excesses? It was likely a combination of all these factors, a slow unwinding of the centuries-old fear. Of course, popular belief in magic and witchcraft didn't just evaporate. In rural communities, folk traditions, beliefs in curses, charms and cunning folk who offered magical remedies and counterspells persisted long after the official persecutions ended. An odd survival, for instance, was the continued use of witch bottles. Remember those charming urine-filled jugs well into the 19th century in some parts of England, showing that at a grassroots level, the fear of harmful magic and the desire for magical protection lingered. It's like when a big software company stops supporting an old operating system. The official updates cease, but some people keep using it out of habit or necessity, even if it's riddled with security holes. The last official execution for witchcraft in England was that of Alice Molland in 1685, though some sources debate this, pointing to later cases where witchcraft was a factor, if not the sole charge. In Scotland, the last execution was Janet Horn in 1727. In France, Louis Debarraz was executed in 1745. Germany saw its last execution, Anna Goldie, in Switzerland, though technically not part of the Holy Roman Empire. Then culturally, Germanic in 1782, a case that caused considerable outcry among Enlightenment thinkers. These dates mark the fading embers of a brutal tradition. The Enlightenment didn't kill the idea of the witch entirely, but it fundamentally changed how society, particularly its legal and intellectual institutions, responded to that idea. The witch was slowly being moved from the courtroom to the realm of folklore, from a diabolical threat to a superstitious relic. The terrifying power of the state was no longer being deployed to hunt and kill her. The fear, while perhaps not extinguished in every heart, was losing its official sanction, its ability to command the gallows and the pyre. The dawn of reason was casting long shadows on the age of witch panics. You step away for a moment from the well-trodden paths of European and colonial American witch hunts, your gaze shifting to encompass a wider world. While the drama of demonic pacts, sabbats, and the Malleus Maleficarum played out with such devastating consequences across Christendom, it's crucial to remember that the fear of harmful magic and the identification of individuals who wielded it was by no means unique to Western Christian society. You find yourself now exploring how these beliefs manifested in diverse cultures across the globe, often with very different nuances and outcomes, long before, during, and after the European burning times. Imagine yourself in a village in sub-Saharan Africa, centuries ago, or even in more recent times, where traditional beliefs remain strong. Here the spiritual world is often intensely immanent, woven into the very fabric of daily life. Ancestral spirits play an active role. Deities and nature spirits influence events, and the power of magic, both for good and ill, is widely acknowledged. In many African societies, the witch, a term often used as a rough English equivalent for complex indigenous concepts, is typically someone who uses innate, often hereditary supernatural power for destructive purposes, to cause illness, death, infertility, crop failure, or other misfortunes within the community. This power is often thought to operate through psychic means, perhaps projected during sleep or in a trance state. It's not necessarily about a pact with an external devil figure in the Christian sense, but about an inherent malevolent capacity. Accusations of witchcraft in these contexts often arise from social tensions, jealousy, or unexplained calamities, much like in Europe. However, the responses can vary greatly. Sometimes it involves divination to identify the source of the witchcraft, followed by rituals of cleansing or exorcism. In other cases, the accused might be ostracized, fined, or in severe instances subjected to ordeals or even killed. A significant difference often lies in the focus. While European witch hunts became increasingly concerned with heresy and allegiance to Satan, many indigenous African systems are more concerned with restoring social harmony and neutralizing the source of harm. The witch is a problem because they disrupt the community, not necessarily because they've signed a contract with a cosmic evil. Now let your mind travel to the indigenous cultures of the Americas, pre-contact and beyond. Here too you find a rich tapestry of beliefs about spiritual power. Shamans or medicine people are respected figures who can communicate with the spirit world, heal the sick, and ensure the well-being of the tribe. But just as there is power for good, there is also the potential for its misuse. A bad shaman or a sorcerer might use their power to harm others, to cause disease, or to control game animals unfairly. Accusations could lead to social exclusion or in some cases violent retribution. Again, the emphasis is often on the harmful act, the maleficium, and the disruption of communal balance. It's like having a trusted community IT guy who knows all the passwords, but then finding out he's been using his admin rights to crash everyone else's computers for kicks. Consider East Asia. In China, for example, traditional beliefs included concerns about Guiyue or Jinkan sorcery, a potent form of black magic involving the cultivation of venomous creatures to create a powerful poison or spirit entity that could be used to harm enemies. Accusations of Gu could lead to severe punishment. Japanese folklore too is rich with tales of spirits, demons, oni, and magic users, with figures like the kitsune fox, spirits sometimes possessing humans or engaging in trickery. While not always fitting the witch stereotype, these beliefs reflect a widespread understanding of supernatural harm and those who might inflict it. Historians still debate how colonialism and the spread of Christianity impacted indigenous beliefs about witchcraft and sorcery around the world. In some cases, missionaries and colonial authorities actively suppressed traditional spiritual practices, labeling them as witchcraft or devil worship, which sometimes ironically led to an intensification of accusations or the syncretic blending of Christian demonology with existing indigenous concepts. The European model of the diabolical witch was sometimes superimposed onto local figures of fear, creating new and often more volatile forms of witch hunting in colonized societies. An odd off-topic fact that touches on global spiritual beliefs: the concept of the evil eye, the idea that a glance filled with envy or malice can cause harm, is incredibly widespread, found in various forms across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, Latin America, parts of Asia, and even some areas of Europe. The prevalence of amulets and talismans like the Nazar in Turkey or the Hamza, hand to ward off the evil eye, speaks to a near-universal human anxiety about unseen, malevolent intent projected by others. It's like a low-level, constant background hum of magical suspicion. It's important to avoid a simplistic everyone did it relativism. The European witch hunts, particularly during their peak, were characterized by a unique combination of systematic theological underpinning. The demonic packed the Sabbath, the use of widespread judicial torture to extract specific detailed confessions, and the power of centralized religious and secular authorities to prosecute on a massive scale. While other cultures certainly had and have their own ways of dealing with perceived harmful magic, the particular machinery of persecution that developed in Christian Europe was distinctive in its scope and its ideological framework. However, by looking beyond Europe, you gain a crucial perspective. The fear of harmful magic and the desire to identify and neutralize those who wield it is a recurring theme in human societies. It speaks to a fundamental human need to find explanations for suffering and misfortune, to maintain social order, and to manage anxieties about the unseen forces that shape our lives. The European witch was one particularly terrifying manifestation of this broader human tendency, but she was not alone on the global stage of supernatural fear. The smoke from the execution pyres has largely cleared across Europe, and the grim pronouncements of witch-hunting magistrates are fading into the historical record. You find yourself now in the 19th century, an era of industrial revolution, burgeoning empires, and a powerful new intellectual and artistic movement, Romanticism. And just as the Enlightenment sought to banish the witch to the realm of superstition, Romanticism, with its fascination for the medieval, the mystical, the emotional, and the untamed, begins to pull her back out, dusting her off, and reimagining her in a very different light. The witch is no longer solely an object of terror and persecution. She's becoming a figure of intrigue, power, and even allure. You stroll through art galleries of the period. Instead of lurid woodcuts depicting demonic sabbats or haggard crones being led to their doom, you see paintings by artists like John William Waterhouse or Henry Fuseli. Their witches are often youthful, beautiful, mysterious, and imbued with a potent, almost seductive, magical aura. Think of Circe, Medea, or the Weird Sisters from Shakespeare's Macbeth. Figures from classical mythology and literature who are reinterpreted through a romantic lens. They are often depicted in dramatic, natural settings, communing with spirits brewing potions, their power intertwined with the wild, untamed forces of nature. This is a far cry from the wretched, malevolent hag of popular witch hunt lore. It's less warty nose and a pointy hat, and more ethereal goth girlfriend who knows her herbs. In literature too, the witch figure undergoes a transformation. Writers of the Gothic and Romantic traditions like Sir Walter Scott, Nathaniel Hawthorne, whose ancestor John Hathorne was a judge at the Salem trials, a fact that deeply troubled him, and later figures like Charles Baudelaire explore themes of the supernatural, the occult, and the darker aspects of human nature. The witch or the sorceress often appears as a character who embodies forbidden knowledge, transgression, or a connection to primal, often feminine power. She might still be dangerous, but she's also compelling a symbol of rebellion against societal norms or a conduit to deeper hidden truths. This period also sees the rise of folklore studies. Scholars like the Brothers Grimm in Germany diligently collect and publish folk tales, many of which feature witches, sorcerers, and magical enchantments. While these tales often preserve older, sometimes frightening depictions of witches, think of the child-eating witch in Hansel and Gretel. Their collection and popularization contribute to the witch's transition from a real-world threat to a character in the realm of story and imagination. The very act of categorizing these stories as folklore or fairy tales helps to distance the witch from the sphere of active belief and persecution, placing her firmly in the cultural past or the world of make-believe. She becomes something to be studied, analyzed, and even enjoyed as part of a national or cultural heritage. Simultaneously, the 19th century witnesses a burgeoning interest in occultism, spiritualism, and esoteric traditions. Movements like Theosophy, founded by Helena Blavatsky, and ceremonial magic orders like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn attract intellectuals, artists, and seekers looking for spiritual alternatives to mainstream religion and scientific materialism. While not directly focused on witchcraft in the old sense, these movements explore ancient wisdom, mystical practices, and the idea of hidden spiritual powers. They contribute to an atmosphere where magic and the supernatural are being re-evaluated not as demonic, but as potentially accessible and even enlightening. You might find yourself in a dimly lit Victorian parlour, attempting to contact spirits through a Ouija board or poring over ancient grimoires in search of forgotten knowledge. Forget the stock market, darling. I'm investing in astral projection and a really good crystal ball. Historians still debate how much this romantic and occult revival drew directly from the historical witch figure versus constructing a new, often idealized version of her. Certainly the image of the powerful independent woman communing with nature, as depicted in some romantic art and literature, bears little resemblance to the terrified, often impoverished victims of the historical witch hunts. Yet this reimagining is a crucial step in the witch's long journey through cultural perception. An odd off-topic fact that reflects the 19th century's fascination with both the scientific and the unexplained, the development of spirit photography. Photographers claim to be able to capture images of ghosts and spirits alongside their living sitters. While largely debunked as hoaxes and double exposures, the popularity of spirit photography, even Mary Todd Lincoln, grieving for her son, sought out a spirit photographer, shows a society grappling with new technologies while still captivated by the possibility of a visible spirit world. It's like an early version of those ghost hunting reality shows, but with more petticoats and fewer night vision cameras. This romanticized and occulted witch is in many ways a reaction against the perceived sterility of pure Enlightenment rationalism and the social constraints of Victorian society, particularly for women. The witch figure, reclaimed and reinterpreted, could represent a form of rebellion, a connection to intuition nature, and a kind of power that existed outside patriarchal structures. She wasn't necessarily good, but she was definitely interesting and increasingly a symbol of something lost or repressed. The groundwork is being laid for the 20th century revival of witchcraft as a modern spiritual path, which we'll touch on later. But for now, in the 19th century, the witch is primarily an inhabitant of art, literature, folklore, and the shadowy corners of occult lodges. She is being transformed from a demonized outcast into a complex, often alluring symbol, her story far from over. The fear may have subsided in the legal sense, but the fascination is just beginning to bloom in new and unexpected ways. You find yourself now, in the 20th century, an era of unprecedented technological advancement, global conflicts, and dizzying social change. It might seem that the figure of the witch, so thoroughly debunked by the Enlightenment and romanticized by the 19th century, would have faded into mere historical curiosity or quaint folklore. And in many ways, she had. But the underlying psychological and social mechanisms that fueled the great witch hunts, the tendency to scapegoat the fear of the other, the power of moral panics, proved to be remarkably resilient. They resurface in new modern guises, sometimes with chilling echoes of the past. One of the most prominent examples of this in the later 20th century is the satanic panic that swept through parts of the United States and other Western countries, primarily in the 1980s and early 1990s. You might be watching daytime talk shows or reading sensationalist news reports filled with alarming and largely unsubstantiated claims of widespread satanic cults engaging in ritual abuse, animal sacrifice, and even human sacrifice. Childcare centers become focal points of accusation with elaborate and often bizarre testimonies from children, sometimes elicited through highly suggestive interviewing techniques by well-meaning but misguided therapists and social workers. The McMartin preschool trial in California is perhaps the most notorious example, a years-long legal ordeal based on fantastical accusations that ultimately resulted in no convictions. The parallels to the historical witch hunts are striking. Just as in earlier centuries you see the diabolical conspiracy, the belief in a hidden organized network of evildoers, Satanists instead of witches, working to corrupt society, particularly targeting children. Spectral evidence. 2. 0. The reliance on dubious, recovered memories of ritual abuse often emerging during therapy, which, like spectral evidence in Salem, are difficult to verify or refute. The power of confession or coerced testimony. Children, as vulnerable accusers, are sometimes led to make claims that fit the pre-existing narrative of satanic abuse, just as accused witches were pressured to confess to sabbats and demonic pacts. The role of experts. Certain therapists, law enforcement officials, and self-proclaimed cult experts emerge much like the demonologists of old, promoting the reality of the threat and offering methods for identifying and combating it. Their books and seminars fuel the panic. You're telling me little Timmy isn't just playing with his action figures, he's reenacting a blood sacrifice he witnessed at his daycare, called the 6 o'clock news. A chilling historical fact related to the satanic panic is the sheer number of unsubstantiated accusations and the devastating impact on the lives of the accused. Daycare workers, parents, and others were subjected to public vilification, lengthy and expensive legal battles, and sometimes imprisonment, often based on flimsy or entirely fabricated evidence. The panic tapped into parental anxieties about child safety, changing social norms like more women in the workforce and children in daycare, and a broader cultural fear of hidden evils. Just like the Malleus Maleficarum provided a how-to for witch hunters, sensationalist books and media reports during the Satanic Panic offered a script for understanding and uncovering supposed satanic conspiracies. Beyond the overt satanic panic, you can see echoes of witch hunt mentalities in other modern moral panics. Think of the Red Scares of the Cold War era, where fear of communism led to blacklisting and persecution of suspected sympathizers, often based on association or flimsy evidence. Or consider how new technologies or subcultures from Dungeons & Dragons in the 80s, accused of promoting Satanism and suicide to certain types of music or video games, today can become targets of fear, blamed for societal ills or corrupting youth. The pattern is familiar: identify an enemy within, exaggerate the threat, and call for measures to root it out, often trampling on individual rights in the process. Historians still debate the complex social and psychological factors that make societies susceptible to such panics. Economic uncertainty, rapid social change, anxieties about cultural identity, and the influence of media narratives all play a role. It seems that when communities feel threatened or unstable, the ancient urge to find a scapegoat, someone to embody the source of their fears, can easily resurface. The label changes, you witch, communist, Satanist, terrorist, but the underlying dynamic of fear, accusation, and ostracism remains disturbingly consistent. An odd off-topic cultural phenomenon that briefly intersected with these fears in the 1970s, there was a fad for pet rocks. People bought ordinary rocks packaged in little boxes with straw and an instruction manual on how to care for them. While utterly harmless and a bit silly, it's a reminder that fads and collective behaviors can take strange forms. Imagine if during the Satanic Panic someone had seriously accused pet rocks of being demonic familiars in disguise. It just sits there, menacingly, and the instruction manual mentions obedience. Clearly a satanic training guide. It's important to note that the 20th century also saw positive re-evaluations of the witch, particularly with the rise of modern paganism and Wicca, which we will explore next. But the shadows of the hunt, the ease with which fear can be weaponized and reason abandoned, linger as a persistent warning. The modern echoes of witch hunt mentalities serve as a sobering reminder that the capacity for irrational fear and persecution is not confined to distant, unenlightened historical periods. It's a human vulnerability that requires constant vigilance, critical thinking, and a commitment to justice to keep in check. The tools of persecution may have changed from pyres and thumbscrews to media sensationalism and flawed legal processes, but the devastating human cost remains. The long dark night of persecution and fear is finally giving way to a different kind of dawn. You stand now in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a time of profound reflection on the past and a remarkable reclaiming of the very figure who was once so reviled and feared. The witch, for so long a symbol of demonic evil or at best a romanticized literary trope, is being re-envisioned and for many rehabilitated. This final leg of our journey explores the enduring legacy of the witch, hunts the efforts to remember and honor the victims, and the emergence of modern witchcraft as a vibrant spiritual path. You witness a growing awareness of the historical injustice of the witch trials. Monuments and memorials begin to appear in places that were once epicenters of persecution: Salem, Massachusetts, Pendle, England, various towns in Germany and Switzerland. These serve as solemn reminders of the thousands of lives destroyed by fear, superstition, and legal brutality. There are public apologies, official exonerations, sometimes centuries late, but symbolically important, and a concerted effort by historians and activists to tell the stories of the victims, to give them back their names and their humanity beyond the stark records of their trials and executions. It's a process of collective remembrance and, for some, atonement. We were wrong. Society seems to whisper across the centuries, and we will not forget. Simultaneously, the figure of the witch is undergoing a powerful resurgence in popular culture, and more significantly as a spiritual identity. The rise of modern paganism, and particularly Wicca, in the mid-20th century marks a pivotal moment in this transformation. Gerald Gardner, an English civil servant and occultist, is largely credited with publicizing Wicca in the 1950s, claiming it to be a survival of an ancient pre-Christian European witch cult, a theory, as we've noted, that most historians now dispute, though it was influential at the time. Regardless of its precise historical origins, Wicca and other forms of contemporary pagan witchcraft offer a spiritual framework that emphasizes reverence for nature, the divine feminine, and often a horned god, a figure quite different from the Christian devil ethical principles like the Wiccan read "an it harm none do what ye will," and the practice of magic for healing, growth, and positive change. This modern witch is not the cackling, malevolent hag of folklore, nor the diabolical servant of Satan from the Malleus Maleficarum. Instead, she or he, as modern witchcraft is open to all genders, is often portrayed as an empowered individual, a healer, a wise woman or man, a seeker of hidden knowledge, and a guardian of the earth. The term witch itself is reclaimed from its negative connotations and worn as a badge of honor, signifying strength, independence, and a connection to ancient traditions, however reinterpreted. It's like taking a slur and turning it into a declaration of power. You see this reflected in books, movies, and television shows where witches are increasingly depicted as protagonists, heroines, or complex anti-heroes rather than simple villains. From Bewitched, a light-hearted early example, to Charmed, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, with its witch character, Willow, and the chilling adventures of Sabrina, popular culture has played a significant role in reshaping public perceptions of witchcraft, often emphasizing themes of female empowerment, sisterhood, and the responsible use of power. Historians still debate the direct lineage between historical accused witches and modern self-identified witches. Most scholars agree that modern Wicca and other pagan witchcraft traditions are primarily 20th century constructions, drawing inspiration from a variety of sources including folklore, ceremonial magic, romantic literature, and anthropological theories, rather than being an unbroken continuation of ancient practices. However, for many practitioners, the spiritual connection to those who were persecuted in the past is deeply felt. They see themselves as honoring the memory of those who suffered for being different, for their knowledge of herbs, or for simply being women in a misogynistic society. An odd and perhaps hopeful off-topic development in recent times is the rise of cottagecore aesthetics, a romanticization of simple rural living, baking, gardening, and traditional crafts. While not directly related to witchcraft, it shares some thematic overlaps with the neo-pagan interest in nature, herbalism, and self-sufficiency, suggesting a broader cultural yearning for connection to the earth and simpler, more mindful ways of life. It's like a gentle, Instagram-filtered echo of the desire to find magic in the mundane. Forget the Sabbath, I'm too busy making sourdough and tending my window box herb garden. The legacy of the fear of witches is a complex one. On one hand, it's a horrifying testament to human cruelty, mass hysteria, and the dangers of unchecked religious and legal power. On the other, the very act of remembering and re-evaluating this history has led to a powerful reclamation. The witch, once the ultimate outsider, has become for many a symbol of resilience, defiance, and the enduring human spirit's quest for meaning and connection in a world that often seems determined to misunderstand or suppress what it fears. The journey has been long and arduous, from ancient whispers of curses to the clang of inquisitorial chains, from the shadow of the gallows to the quiet circle of a modern coven. The fear, though it may still flicker in the dark corners of human psychology, no longer holds the same power. The witch in many ways has finally come into her own, and so our long journey through the shadowy history of the fear of witches and its myriad victims comes to a close. We've walked through ancient river valleys where the first whispers of harmful magic were codified into law, and stood in the grim courthouses of Salem where spectral evidence condemned the innocent. We've felt the chill of the Inquisitor's gaze, informed by manuals that turned misogyny into a theological weapon, and witnessed the terror of entire communities gripped by panic, searching for scapegoats in times of profound upheaval. From the complex magical landscape of Rome to the syncretic folk beliefs of the early Middle Ages, we saw how the understanding of witchcraft slowly morphed, solidifying into a terrifying vision of diabolical conspiracy that fueled centuries of persecution across Europe. We noted England's somewhat peculiar path and crossed the ocean to see how these ancient fears took root and flared with tragic consequence in the New World. Then a gradual shift as the Enlightenment's cool reason began to dampen the fires of irrational fear, and the witch slowly transitioned from a real-world threat to a figure of folklore and romantic fascination. We took a brief but important detour to acknowledge that the fear of harmful magic was never solely a European phenomenon, finding echoes and unique expressions in cultures across the globe. Finally, we saw how the 20th and 21st centuries brought not only disturbing modern manifestations of witch hunt mentalities in moral panics, but also a powerful reclaiming of the witch figure herself. As a subject of solemn remembrance, a symbol of resilience, and for many a vibrant spiritual identity. The journey has been one of darkness, certainly filled with suffering and injustice, but it also speaks to the enduring human capacity to confront the shadows of the past, to learn, and perhaps to slowly, painstakingly find a more compassionate way forward. The fear may never be entirely extinguished, but knowledge, empathy, and the gentle light of understanding can keep it at bay. End of script. Good night.